What if one of the most important heating technologies in Viking history ran on something most people today would throw away without a second thought? Not firewood, not coal, not some forgotten furnace buried in the past. Just a lump of animal fat, a small bowl carved from stone, and a simple strand of moss. At first, it sounds almost ridiculous, far too simple to matter in a land known for brutal winters and endless nights. How could something so ordinary possibly help people survive the freezing landscapes of Scandinavia? And yet, archaeologists continue to uncover these objects inside ancient Viking homes. Small stone lamps, their surfaces blackened by centuries of smoke and flame. They look humble, almost primitive. Easy to ignore beside the famous ships, swords, and treasures we usually associate with the Viking world. But these quiet artifacts tell a very different story. Behind their simplicity hides a remarkably clever survival technology, one that provided steady light, gentle warmth, and precious efficiency during the darkest months of the year. Because in the Viking Age, winter was never just a season. It was a test of survival. And sometimes, the smallest flame was powerful enough to keep that survival alive. In the northern lands, where the Vikings lived, winter was not a passing inconvenience. It was a dominant force that could grip the landscape for nearly half the year. As autumn faded, the sun began its slow retreat. Day by day, it sank lower in the sky, until in the farthest reaches of the north, it barely rose at all. In some places, the world lingered in a dim twilight for weeks, with only a pale glow brushing the horizon before darkness returned again. Outside, the land transformed into a frozen wilderness, snow-buried fields and pathways beneath thick white drifts, rivers hardened into solid ice. Bitter winds swept down from the mountains and across the fjords, carrying sharp crystals of frost that stung the skin and cut through clothing. Survival in such a place demanded preparation. Inside their longhouses, Viking families gathered together beneath heavy turf roofs, designed to trap warmth and block the relentless cold. These buildings were long wooden halls, sturdy, practical shelters where entire households lived, worked, and slept through the harsh season. But even the strongest walls could not create heat on their own. Warmth required fire, and fire required wood. Keeping a hearth burning day and night through the winter consumed enormous amounts of fuel. During the short summer and autumn months, communities worked constantly to cut, haul, and stack enough firewood to last until spring. Piles of logs became as valuable as food itself. Yet once the storms arrived, gathering more fuel could become dangerous. Snow buried the forests. Icy winds made travel slow and exhausting. Venturing too far from shelter carried real risk. Every log placed on the fire was one less piece of wood left for the months ahead. So the Vikings faced a constant and urgent problem. How do you preserve warmth and light through endless winter nights without burning through all the wood your survival depends on? The answer, surprisingly, was already living beside them. Animals. Livestock stood at the very center of Viking life. In the rugged landscapes of the north, animals were far more than a source of food. They were the foundation of survival. Cows, sheep, goats, and pigs supplied nearly everything a household needed. Their meat fed families through long winters. Their hides became clothing and boots, strong enough to withstand cold winds and frozen ground. Bones were shaped into tools, needles, and fishing hooks. Even horns could be carved into drinking vessels or trade goods. Yet among all the resources these animals provided, one substance held a particularly quiet but powerful value: fat. In modern science, we understand why it mattered so much. Fat is one of the most energy-dense substances found in nature, capable of storing an enormous amount of chemical energy in a surprisingly small volume. It is concentrated fuel, compact, and efficient. The Vikings, of course, did not know the chemistry behind it, but they understood its power through generations of experience. After animals were slaughtered for food, the fatty tissues were never wasted. Instead, they were carefully collected and processed. Large chunks of fat were slowly heated over low flames in a method we now call rendering. As the heat worked through the tissue, the pure liquid fat gradually separated from water and protein. The result was a clean, stable fuel known as tallow or lard. Once cooled, it hardened into a dense, waxy substance that could be stored for long periods, especially in the cold climates of Scandinavia, where spoilage was slower. Properly rendered fat could last through months of winter without losing its usefulness. This material quickly became one of the most versatile resources in the Viking household. It was used in cooking, adding precious calories to meals that helped people endure the cold. It preserved leather, keeping boots and clothing flexible instead of brittle in freezing weather. It coated tools and metal surfaces, protecting them from rust and moisture. But at some point, someone discovered something even more remarkable. Animal fat did not only sustain life as food, it could also sustain a flame. When carefully burned, fat produced a slow, steady fire that lasted far longer than many people would expect. That simple realization opened the door to a new kind of technology, one that would quietly transform daily life inside Viking homes. From that discovery emerged one of the most important household tools in the Viking world. Once the Vikings discovered that animal fat could burn slowly and steadily, they faced a new challenge. The fuel was useful, but it needed the right container. A simple wooden bowl would scorch. Clay could crack under sudden heat. What they needed was a material strong enough to hold a flame, yet practical enough to shape with the tools they had. The answer came from the earth itself. Across parts of Scandinavia, Vikings had access to a soft gray stone known today as soapstone. At first glance, it looked plain and almost unremarkable, the kind of rock many people might overlook. But to those who worked with it, soapstone possessed a set of remarkable qualities that made it ideal for everyday life. First, it was surprisingly easy to carve. Compared to harder rocks like granite, soapstone was soft enough to shape with simple iron tools and even earlier stone tools. A skilled craftsperson could patiently hollow it into bowls, cups, cooking pots, and eventually lamps. This made it a practical material for households that needed durable objects without complex metalworking. But the stone's most valuable quality revealed itself when it met heat. Soapstone is exceptionally resistant to thermal stress. It can sit directly beside fire or even within flames without cracking or shattering. Instead of breaking under heat, the stone absorbs it slowly, storing warmth deep within its structure. Even more importantly, it releases that heat gradually. This meant that a lamp carved from soapstone was not merely a container for burning fat. As the small flame flickered inside the bowl, the surrounding stone gently warmed. Over time, the entire lamp became a quiet reservoir of stored heat. And long after the visible flame had weakened, the warmed stone continued to radiate a soft, steady warmth back into the room. In the harsh climate of the Viking world, even small amounts of retained heat mattered. A few degrees of warmth drifting through the air could make the difference between comfort and bitter cold during a winter night. What began as a simple carved bowl slowly revealed itself as something more sophisticated. A lamp, a heat source, a miniature heater created from nothing more than stone, fat, and fire. Of course, fuel and stone alone could not create fire. Something had to connect the two, a delicate bridge between solid fat and the open air where a flame could live. That bridge was the wick. In later centuries, lamps would rely on cotton threads or carefully woven cords, but the Vikings worked with the materials their landscape provided. They turned to the fibers growing all around them, simple, natural substances that could quietly perform a remarkable task. One of the most common was bog moss. Across the wetlands of northern Europe, this soft, spongy plant grew in thick layers across the ground. At first glance, it seemed fragile and insignificant, but bog moss possessed an unusual and valuable property. It could absorb and hold liquid with extraordinary efficiency. When gathered, dried, and twisted into thin strands, the moss could act like a natural wick. As the fat inside the lamp slowly melted from the heat of the flame, the fibers gently pulled the liquid upward. The process happened automatically, driven by capillary action, the same subtle force that allows water to climb through the tiny channels of plant stems. Without pumps, without moving parts, the wick carried fuel upward drop by drop, feeding the flame in a slow and steady rhythm. And moss was not the only option. Fibers left over from flax used in textile production could be twisted into strands. Hemp fibers worked just as well. Even scraps of worn-out wool clothing found a second life inside the lamp. In Viking society, nothing useful was wasted. Materials were reused again and again, each object serving multiple purposes across its lifetime. A garment that once protected someone from the cold might eventually help light the very room where they slept. But the real brilliance of the Viking fat lamp did not come from any single piece. Not the stone, not the fuel, and not the wick alone. It came from the way all three worked together, forming a quiet and reliable system that could keep a flame alive deep into the long northern night. When most people picture an old lamp, they imagine a bowl filled with liquid oil and a bright flame dancing above it. The Viking fat lamp worked in a very different and surprisingly clever way. Instead of pouring liquid fuel into the lamp, people placed a solid chunk of animal fat directly inside the carved stone bowl. The wick rested gently along the surface of the fat, barely touching it. Then the flame was lit. At first, almost nothing seemed to happen, but slowly, the heat from the small flame began to melt a tiny pocket of fat right around the wick. That thin layer turned into liquid and rose through the fibers, feeding the flame at the tip. Meanwhile, the rest of the fat remained solid. As the flame consumed the melted fuel, its heat gradually softened the next thin layer beneath it. Another small pool formed. The wick absorbed it. The flame continued to burn. Again and again, the cycle repeated. This simple mechanism created a natural form of fuel control. Instead of melting the entire supply at once, the lamp released energy slowly, a thin layer at a time. The solid fat acted like a reservoir, feeding the flame only as much fuel as it needed to keep burning. The result was extraordinary efficiency. In larger soapstone lamps capable of holding several pounds of fat, the flame could burn quietly for an entire day, sometimes even longer, without needing to be refilled. It wasn't a roaring fire. There was no bright blaze filling the room with light. Instead, the lamp produced a soft, steady glow, a quiet flame that endured hour after hour, barely flickering, patiently holding back the darkness. And in the long winters of the Viking world, that kind of quiet persistence made all the difference. A single lamp, no matter how efficient, could never warm an entire Viking home on its own. But the Vikings did not rely on just one source of heat. Their homes were carefully arranged to capture and preserve every possible trace of warmth. In many ways, the Viking longhouse functioned like a quiet thermal system, where multiple small heat sources worked together to keep the interior livable through the long northern winter. At the center of the building burned the main hearth, a long fire that stretched down the middle of the hall. This was the heart of the household. It was where food was cooked, tools were heated, and the greatest share of warmth was produced. But maintaining that fire demanded a constant supply of wood. Keeping it blazing through the entire night would quickly consume precious fuel, so the hearth was often allowed to burn lower after evening meals, glowing with embers rather than roaring flames. This is where the smaller lamps played their role. Throughout the longhouse, fat lamps quietly filled the darker corners with steady light and gentle heat. Some were placed in shallow niches along the walls beside wooden sleeping benches. Others hung from iron chains above work tables, where hands still labored in the dim winter evenings. A few rested on carved wooden stands, their flames casting warm reflections across the timber beams. Even the structure of the house itself helped preserve warmth. The walls were built from thick layers of turf, packed earth, and heavy timber. These natural materials acted as insulation, trapping heat inside and shielding the interior from icy winds outside. And warmth came from more than fire alone. In many longhouses, livestock were kept in connected sections of the building. Sheep, goats, or cattle shared the shelter, and their body heat slowly drifted into the main hall. Dozens of people sleeping together beneath the same roof added warmth of their own. When all of these elements worked together, the glowing hearth, the quiet lamps, the insulated walls, the animals, and the gathered household, the interior climate slowly stabilized. It was never truly warm by modern standards. But in the frozen landscapes of the north, even a few degrees above the biting cold outside, could mean the difference between enduring the winter or not surviving it at all. What makes the Viking heating system even more remarkable is not only its simplicity, but its efficiency. Viking society was built on a deep understanding of resources, where nearly everything had value and almost nothing was thrown away. In the harsh environments of Northern Europe, waste was a luxury people could not afford. Every part of an animal had a purpose. The finest and cleanest fat was reserved for cooking, adding precious calories to meals that helped sustain families through long winters. Slightly lower quality fat still had important uses. It could be rubbed into leather to keep boots and clothing flexible in freezing temperatures, or applied to wooden tools and containers to seal them against moisture. And fat that had spoiled or turned rancid, no longer suitable for eating, was far from useless. It became fuel. That aged fat could be placed inside stone lamps and burned slowly for light and warmth. The smell might not have been pleasant, but in the middle of a dark winter night, a steady flame mattered far more than comfort. Even bones were never truly discarded. After meals, leftover bones were often collected, crushed, and boiled in water. As they simmered, the last traces of grease hidden deep within the bone slowly melted free and rose to the surface. That thin layer of grease could then be skimmed off and saved. It was not a large amount, but it still burned. Coastal communities applied the same idea to fish. Heads, organs, and skeletons left behind from food preparation were boiled down to extract thick oils. In some fishing villages, this oil became the primary fuel for lamps, providing light throughout the dark months. Through practices like these, every animal provided energy twice. First, as nourishment, then as fuel. The result was a remarkably efficient system, a kind of natural recycling cycle where almost nothing was wasted. In a world where survival depended on careful use of every resource, this mindset turned even scraps and leftovers into something valuable. And that quiet efficiency helped Viking communities endure winters that might otherwise have been impossible to survive. Imagine stepping inside a Viking longhouse on a harsh winter evening, while a storm rages across the northern landscape. Outside, the wind roars through the mountains and sweeps across the fjords, carrying sharp grains of ice through the darkness. Snow drifts across the frozen ground, and the cold presses heavily against the wooden walls of the hall. But inside, the world feels very different. A warm orange glow flickers gently across the heavy timber beams overhead. The fire in the central hearth breathes softly, its embers glowing deep red beneath a thin veil of ash. Nearby, a small stone lamp burns quietly beside a wooden sleeping bench, its flame steady and patient. Another lamp sways slightly from a roof beam above a table where someone carefully repairs a tool by lamplight. The air is thick with the living sense of the household wood smoke drifting from the hearth, the faint oily smell of burning fat from the lamps, leather drying near the fire, damp wool cloaks hung along the wall, and the distant warmth of livestock sheltered in the adjoining space. Shadows glide slowly across the turf-lined walls as the flames move with the gentle draft of the room. Somewhere in the hall, a voice rises above the quiet crackle of the fire. A storyteller recites ancient sagas, tales of voyages, battles, and distant seas while children sit close to the hearth, listening in silence. The room feels alive, sheltered, protected from the relentless winter outside. And at the heart of that fragile safety burns a flame no larger than a candle, small, steady, and quietly holding back the cold darkness of the northern night. Today, warmth arrives. With the push of a button, electricity flows invisibly through walls. Gas heaters ignite instantly. Entire buildings are warmed by systems so complex that most of us never think about where the energy truly comes from. But for the Vikings, warmth was never invisible. It was something they could see, measure, and feel in the most direct way possible. Every spark mattered. Every piece of fuel carried value. A careless fire could waste precious wood that might be needed weeks later. A well-designed lamp, on the other hand, could stretch a small resource across an entire night. Instead of trying to overpower nature with massive technology, Viking communities learned to work with the natural world around them. Their solutions were simple, but deeply intelligent. A bowl carved from stone, a wick twisted from moss, a small block of animal fat. From these humble elements, they created a system that provided light, gentle warmth, and remarkable efficiency. A lamp that could glow quietly through the long northern night. A flame that helped preserve heat inside the house and allowed families to endure months of darkness and freezing cold. At first glance, it may seem like a tiny invention, but sometimes the smallest technologies carry the greatest wisdom. Because when people learn to recognize the hidden value in every resource, even scraps that others might throw away, survival becomes possible in places that seem almost unlivable. That mindset may be the true legacy of these ancient lamps. A reminder that human ingenuity does not always require complexity, machinery, or massive energy systems. Sometimes it begins with something far simpler: observation, patience, and a deep understanding of how the natural world works. The Vikings did not simply endure their environment. They studied it, they adapted to it, and they built tools that quietly worked with its laws rather than fighting against them. If stories like this spark your curiosity about ancient survival knowledge, forgotten technologies, and the remarkable ways our ancestors adapted to extreme environments, then you are exactly where you belong. Here on Primal Heritage, we explore the ideas, skills, and innovations that helped humanity survive long before the modern world existed. Because sometimes the past still holds answers we have not fully rediscovered yet.